So last Thursday night, as I had mentioned, I was recording a pilot for a late night spiritual talk show called One with Everything, with a house band and the whole deal. You ever have that experience where you just wonder, well, how did I get here? I certainly had that experience as the band was playing and the announcer, it was live from the Bijou Theater in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and walking out with 4 cameras and a live studio audience, and it was a blast. I really had fun. Everyone I worked with, all the folks are just so creative and fun. But toward the end of the evening, though, I because there was so much going on, I missed dinner, and I drank some yerba mate right before the show, so I was a little wired with no fuel, you know that? So I was introducing the science segment with Dr. David Vago, who's a instructor at Harvard and a fellow with the Mind Life Institute. So I was giving my little introduction, and I said, let me give you a very simplified overview of how meditation made its way to the West. So when the Buddha had his awakening, for 40 years he traveled by foot all through northern Italy. And everyone laughed just like you did. And then I said, and they loved it so much. So I lost my concentration. And with that as a segue, I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about cultivating concentration and cultivating its partner, which is mindfulness, the actual cultivating awareness itself. There's a differentiation between concentration and mindfulness. You could say that concentration is looking intently at the TV screen, and mindfulness is observing what's happening on the screen and how you're relating to it. So concentration is very, very focused, and mindfulness is sort of that which is aware. The other analogy is that concentration is the lens of the camera, which you can focus very, very sharp and zoom in. And mindfulness would be the chip that's recording the information. So I'd like to talk about concentration as a form of willful practice, but also how you can incline yourself to cultivate concentration. And talk a little bit about the byproduct of concentration, which paradoxically enough is tranquility and calming. And I'll talk a little bit about how mindfulness is the liberation factor in our practice, the capacity to observe without judgment, where you can see patterns in new and fresh ways, which results in the arising of insight, of seeing clearly, seeing what's actually true. So the two work very powerfully together, but specific techniques will help you to cultivate certain skills. And then if we have any time, we'll take some practice questions as well. So concentration is kind of a paradox. It's a willful practice, but it also requires that the more you relax, the more you can actually see in a one-pointed way. So I'd like to read you something. I'd mentioned this story before in the past, but this comes from the yogic tradition, talking about the cultivation of dharana, or one-pointedness. It's the story of Arjuna, who was trained as a great warrior, and then who had to go into battle, and all that arose in his experience around conflict, moving through life, and the teachings from Krishna. One bright sunny morning, a large group of young boys gathered by the woodland with their bows and arrows. But these were not just ordinary boys. These were the 5 Pandavas and 100 Kauravas. The 5 Pandava brothers and 100 Kaurava brothers were cousins in a fierce rivalry which began when they were only children. These young princes would eventually grow up to men of incredible power. On this day, Drona, their mentor and military expert, organized a competition to test their concentration. Across a stream, Drona set up a small wooden bird in a tree. Upon returning to the boys, he said, "Okay, children, today I want to see who among you can strike the eye of the wooden bird across the stream." The bird appeared tiny from where they were standing, but the boys were confident they could pass their teacher's test. They had already felled great beasts on their hunts before. How could a small bird pose a challenge? Anxiously, each one of the young princes waited for them to call their names. Yushidra, the eldest of the Pandavas, was called upon first. Taking position by his teacher, he crouched slightly and drew his bowstring taut. "Can you see the bird properly? Tell me everything you can see, Yushidra." Wanting to be thorough, Yushidra began to list off everything that met his eyes. "I see the wooden bird, the branch and the leaves and the tree. I can see the leaves moving and even more birds sitting in the same tree. I can see the stream, the grass, the trees, and the sky." Like this, Yushidra named off everything he could think of, and when he finished, he waited for his master's final command to shoot. Drona spoke again. "Put down your bow and take a seat. You will not hit the eye of the bird." Confused, Yushidra silently walked back to his brothers without question. The next boy was called forward and asked the same question. He gave a similar answer, naming everything he could see. And once again, the boy was told to put away his bow. The same pattern continued with every boy that followed, until finally Drona reached Arjuna. Drona suppressed a knowing smile as the prince took his place, notching his bow and drew his string. Arjuna was one of Drona's favorites. "Tell me what you can see, Arjuna." "I can see only the eye of the bird," replied Arjuna without breaking eye contact with his target. "Can you not see the trees and sky? Or perhaps the branch the bird is sitting on?" "No, sir. All I can see is the eye and nothing else." Drona was pleased with this response. He cast a glance at the crowd of boys who were held in silence, but slowly began nodding as the lesson became clear to them. "Shoot," he said. With a loud twang, the arrow sprang from the bow straight into the bird's eye. A perfect shot. The bird fell with a small thud, and all the boys looked with amazement at Arjuna. After a long pause, Drona patted Arjuna on the back and said, "Now you see the power of concentration." Concentration is one-pointed, moment-to-moment awareness of an object, on an object, whatever that object may be. Very, very challenging to do so. And you may have noticed with whatever anchor you chose for that 30-minute meditation, if you were to sort of have a graph of how often you were actually engaged with your target, how many minutes would you say you were actually there? So there's an element of concentration practice which is a training. You're actually training your mind. I've certainly found this to be true when I've been on long retreats where I spent days lost in thought or working through some issue or something like that, and doing a meditation and realizing I never once was aware of my anchor. What happens when we can practice moment to moment, sustained attention on something? is you actually experience a very interesting biochemical shift. There can be a tremendous calming that occurs. The benefits of cultivating concentration are really quite extraordinary. On a pragmatic level, when you're really concentrated, you get a lot done. You can move through this world of distractions, so much competing for your attention. You learn how to navigate through all the different waves and modifications of the mind. And you actually develop that capacity for willpower. Remember when I lived in the ashram, my nieces would come to visit from time to time, and they would join our kids program. And they grew up without television. And I remember the people who ran the kids program were amazed, because my nieces would find a game, read the instructions, set it up, play the game, and then put it away. When so many of the other kids couldn't keep attention on anything. The paradox in doing concentration practice is that we can get very tight around it. And you may have noticed during that 30 minutes, perhaps you built some tension. So when you would sort of pause and relax, you may have noticed more of a capacity to sort of return back to your anchor. So the relaxation is a very, very important element in this practice. The byproduct of concentration, again, is calm, tranquility. And it can be very, very challenging to engage in a practice like this when you're living a very stressful urban life. And it can be helpful sometimes to look for practices that can really engage your concentration, while a physical practice like yoga or exercise, Tai Chi, can be a very powerful way of engaging so you get the benefit of that calming. As I have mentioned many times before, concentration is very powerful. And when you apply deepening and deepening concentration in your meditation practice, amazing non-ordinary experiences open up. The jhanas are these deep, deep levels of concentration. A quality of joy, a quality of very, very deep absorption arises. And at the same time, there are many, many concentrated people on the planet who are miserable. So there's something that complements concentration. It's not the end of practice. Although you can spend a lot of time doing concentration practice, and the benefit will carry you for a very, very long time. So how is it that concentration leads to a sense of calming and even a sense of joy? As I was reflecting on this, I remembered a really blissful experience I regularly had that might clarify this, it might not. When I was in college, my first year, I was pretty miserable, and I grew up on a farm, and I've worked on farms, and nature is very, very important to me, and living in a city just didn't cut it for me. And I also lost touch with my meditation practice. And I had this fantasy of finding a farm where I could live off campus and sort of be engaged in that lifestyle that's so healing for me, but also get my meditation practice going. And by some kind of grace, I met a fellow, John Peterson, who was a graduate of my college, who grew up on a local farm, and his father had died, and he had to leave school to go and take care of the farm. He was also really into meditation. I was very into transcendental meditation at that time, and so was he. And so I sort of popped out there for an afternoon and stayed for the next 5 years. And we ran 1,000 acres, and we had 500 hogs. I was the livestock manager, so my days were pretty amazing. I'd get up around 4. I would meditate and then work with the animals and go into my classes. And wherever I was, about 8:30, I was asleep. So I tried to be home by then. So I drove a lot of equipment. With 1,000 acres is a huge amount of work. And one of the tasks I loved the most was cultivating corn. We had a 6-row corn planter, and as the corn was growing, a cultivator are basically these tines that you sort of drag between the rows that sort of dig up the weeds. So with the tractor, you have to open the wheels so they go between the rows, the front and the back. They're set very, very wide. And then you have the cultivator, which there would be some in front and some in back of the tractor. And basically I'd just sit sort of like this and line up the tire between the rows. Now, if my concentration was off by about 5 inches, I'd be tearing up 6 rows of corn, which was a pretty horrible thing to do. So I really, really had to pay attention. And I think we had about 125 acres in corn. It might have been more. So 3 times I would go through the fields. And initially the corn was this big, and then I could barely get over it without knocking the stalks over. But I found that I loved that practice. I found it to be kind of blissful. And I realized what was happening was I was deeply, deeply concentrated. And at the same time, through that concentration, there was a real quality of well-being. And I even had ecstatic moments where I felt like I was just sort of blessing the corn as I was driving over it. And actually had some very, very powerful kind of ecstatic experiences. But the primary thing was that sense of concentration. That once I got established in concentration, and I could just relax into it, this incredible spaciousness, kind of an opening of the heart, and even the sense of the mystery, driving up and down these long, long rows in the Midwest. We've all touched into moments of what we call flow. There's a wonderful book by, I butcher his name every time, but Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a book called Flow, which is about how when you can access that sense of present moment awareness, you open in a very powerful way to a sense of life just sort of flowing through you, these ecstatic moments. So any moment where you are feeling deep, deep happiness, whether that being intimate with another person, or being in nature, or hanging out with a pet, or involved in a task that you're really, really focused on, you're very deeply concentrated, but you're also deeply relaxed. When people play sports and they're into that sense of the zone, you know, as Wayne Gretzky says, I skate to where the puck is going to be. You just have a sense of where it's going to go. Concentration is the doorway to those states. So I thought we might just do a short reflection on these observations, just for a few minutes. So you might like to close your eyes. And just select one anchor. The breath of the nostrils, the breath at your belly, the sounds around you, maybe the feeling in the palms of your hands. And in your own way, bring all of your attention to this. And as you establish your concentration, your attention on this, is it possible to soften your body, soften the forehead, the tongue, relax the palms and the belly. And just feel what happens when and if you can sustain your attention here. One definition of meditation is the moment to moment to moment awareness of what is happening. And for the next few moments, how intimately can you experience this point? The second definition, or the complementary definition, as you are noticing what is happening, is to notice your relationship to what is happening. Can you sense who you are as the observer? Is it possible to hold your experience right now without judgment? To simply let it be. And then as you're ready, gently deepening your breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open, or if you like, you can remain with them closed. So noticing what's happening as it's happening. And then noticing your relationship to what's happening. And this introduces the mindfulness piece, the awareness piece. So the other day, I was driving down, actually it was right over here on Glebe, coming down from Old Dominion. And I was behind a car. It was like just this sedan. And I looked at the car, and there wasn't anyone driving it. And I thought, this is one of those Google driverless cars. It was pretty exciting, you know. It was just like a mid-sized sedan, and it was going well below the speed limit, you know. And I thought, wow, this is so cool, because I looked really, really carefully. There was no one in that car, you know. So I followed it for a while, and then I passed it because I really wanted to check it out and see what one of these, you know, Google driverless cars are. And then I saw the knuckles on the steering wheel. And then as I passed, I saw, you know, this tiny, tiny person, you know, looking through the steering wheel as they were driving down the road. So part of that was sort of like looking very, very closely, you know, and thinking I knew what it was, and then sort of staying with it and realizing I was completely off. Oftentimes, when we're practicing meditation or we're practicing mindful awareness, we come in contact with the entire human experience. ranging from the 10,000 joys to the 10,000 sorrows. We encounter physical pain, we encounter strong emotions, we encounter strong, intense mental states. Concentration helps you to identify what's there. Mindfulness opens up how you can be with it. Oftentimes when I work one-on-one with someone, we usually start with an inquiry of what's between you and feeling free. I kind of do an inventory of, okay, so here are all the things that are between me and feeling free, all the issues. And at some point, we'll investigate something that wants some attention. And our primary investigation is sort of shifting from the story of it to the experience of it, to how your body holds that experience. So we use concentration to identify as intimately as we can. When you think about that issue, can you locate where it feels, where you feel it inside? Its size, its shape. Oftentimes by looking closer into the experience, the biological experience of an issue, we'll then shift the inquiry. And there are different inquiries that are very helpful. If you were to hold this in some kindness, what might move or shift or change? Is there a sense of what this is all about? Is there a sense of how this wants you to be with it right now? These are the questions that shift our relationship to what is happening, that allow us to really come in contact with what's actually happening, and can open up new possibilities on how to be with it. So mindfulness is non-judging awareness. When you use concentration to bring yourself back again and again and again, when you calm, when you take the muddy water and just set it on the countertop, the silt begins to fall. The mind becomes more clear. And from that relaxed place, you are more able to identify what's actually going on in your life, what you're actually feeling. You begin to see the repetitive patterns. You begin to see the beliefs, kind of the software that's part of your life experience. And then it allows us to open up, to ask ourselves, what is really true? What do I know to be true? And from here, there's the possibility of what we call insight. To see kind of outside our normal reactions to life. So I'm fascinated by insight, by the intuitive flashes that we get. When we begin to see how our life is confined by greed and hatred, by craving, by ill will, and we begin to sense the possibility of letting go, it gets very, very exciting. I have here a story I really like, but it's really long. So I'm going to save it. But it's a really good one. So you're going to have to come back. I think what we'll do is I'd like to share with you a little meditation that might open up a sense of a little taste of insight for you. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for any questions you have about your practice, anything you might be working with or struggling with in your practice. So So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might like to do a little inventory of something that's between you and feeling free. It might be helpful maybe to make it a little more specific. If there's anyone you're in relationship with where it feels like there's some separation or some dissatisfaction on your part. So you might just take a few moments and kind of go through the files, something you might like to investigate over this brief meditation. If you can't think of anything, you can just make something up. Just sort of try it on. And if there's anyone who needs a little more time to kind of come up with something you'd like to investigate, you can just raise your hand if you need a little more time. Okay. So you might take a few moments to imagine a scene where you're with this other person or with people. If you're visual, you might create the scene as a little video clip or a still. You might turn up the colors a little bit. You might explore the auditory element, any words or tone of voice that's part of this, associated with this image. And now you might turn your attention to what it feels like inside. When you think of this situation, at its most chronic, can you locate what that feels like inside? Can you sense any shape or texture or color? Concentration can help you to identify clearly what it feels like. Is there an emotion that you can identify that resonates with this feeling? Is there a sense of how this would like you to be with it right now? If you were to hold this in some form of loving presence, of compassion or kindness, how does that move or shift or change on the inside? Is there a sense of what you're wanting that isn't happening? If you were to do a role reversal with the other person or the other people, is there a sense of what they're wanting? Now we'll do a short visualization. If you can imagine yourself with this other person or people, imagine the space in which you're in. Imagine having a difficult conversation with them, kind of what it's like when it's not working. And then you might just freeze the frame and imagine that you're up on the ceiling looking down. And while you're up in the ceiling looking down at this sort of freeze frame, you contact a wise being. It might be the Buddha, it might be Christ, it might be just some deep, wise, compassionate being. And then you might imagine, as you stay on the ceiling, this being coming down into your body, speaking with your voice. What would it say? How would it act? Just take a few moments to let that play through. And then imagine this being now joining you back on the ceiling and offering just a few words or a phrase of advice or counsel for you. And then letting this all sort of fade away, come back to the breath. And then when you're ready, you can let your eyes open. I find sometimes that visualization can be helpful. It helps us to shift the frame of our perspective. I think of this dance of concentration and mindfulness. It's really summed up in those two fundamental inquiries, which you can ask at any time. What is my experience right now? To use concentration and awareness to identify what's true right now. And the second inquiry, can I be with this? Can I allow this? Those two questions really form the two wings of the practice. Ultimately, they're the expression of wisdom, the recognition of what is true, and compassion, the capacity to be with and to allow. This is what really helps us to open to new possibilities. So I am curious if you have any questions about your practice, anything I may have mentioned or anything at all. We'll have just a few minutes. We're going to bring you a mic. Here it comes.
Jonathan, both of us come from the same kind of meditation tradition, which was transcendental meditation. And over the years that I've worked with you, you never do use the mantra anymore. And I was wondering why. Does it not work, or?
Yeah, well, so transcendental meditation falls into the category of concentration, but rather than the sensations, you're using a mantra. And so when the mind wanders, you bring the mind back to the mantra. How many of us got trained in TM? Just curious, yeah. It's a wonderful technique. I mean, I did it intensely for 15 years. I did a lot of their advanced trainings. I was actually on my way to do their Siddhi program, which is a really intense, wild program, if you know it, when I stopped in the ashram for lunch, and I stayed there for 24 years. But there's a distinction between a mantra-based practice and a sense-based practice. And basically what they say in TM is the more dynamic your rest, the more dynamic your activity. So mantra is, I find, to be very soothing, very calming. And I found it very, very helpful. I got very rested. It gave me a lot of, I started when I was 15, and it just gave me confidence and creativity, and I was a maniac for it. Then when I shifted to the Buddhist approach, of the sense-based practice, it was very, very difficult for me. It was much more confrontational. So I remember I was in a little argument with my wife, and she said, well, but when you do mantra, don't you find it to be kind of trancy? And I said, no. So then I was meditating, and I thought, this is kind of trancy. It's very, very soothing, very, very restful. But because it's a mental technique, it does take you to a wonderful place. And I love mantra, and I practice it some. The sense-based practice, is very much about here and now. You know, while in mantra, you're sort of invited to just go with it. You can feel very cloud-like, and again, it's a wonderful, wonderful technique. And for some people, it is the practice. It's just what they need. But the sense-based has very much of a sense of here, of now. Can I be with this? I find it to be, it's harder in a sense, but there's a lot of fruit in the practice. Yeah.
What about when you're in a place where you can't be with it? Is that a good place to go?
So the question is, what if you can't be with it? Is mantra a good place to go? Yeah, I think it can be, because of course, as you go through life, there's a lot you can't be with. You know, so then the question becomes, how do you find a resource? You know, how do you resource yourself when you're in intense physical pain, really, really strong emotion, when your mind is completely, you know, gonzo reactive, when you're lost in all of those states? Then the question becomes, what is your strategy when you feel that sense of overwhelm? And mantra can be a very soothing practice, you know, in that case. You know, the calming practice is very, very, very helpful. But I have to say, I went into anaphylactic shock once from a bee sting, and I was, you know, I was watching time fall away and all of that stuff, and I was in a car. A friend was driving me, you know, through town, and I remember thinking, oh, I should do mantra, you know, because like maybe I'll do mantra. So I started doing mantra. Then the pain got really bad, and I thought, screw that. So you got to do what you got to do. Yeah. But it is a wonderful technique. And if you're familiar with Father Thomas Keating in contemplative prayer, you take a phrase, you know, that has meaning for you, and that becomes your mantra. You come back to the mantra. It's a beautiful practice. You know, I did it very, very intensely for many years. But these different techniques wake up different parts of the brain. And, you know, not that long ago, if you wanted to learn a meditation technique, you learned what was available. For me, it was TM. I didn't know there were any other techniques. You know, that's what I did. And what I think is so wonderful now is sort of like with the explosion of these secret teachings. You know, there are these esoteric teachings that were available to no one but the most elite practitioners. They're available now as a free PDF download. You know, it's pretty amazing. Yeah. Thanks.
At church here, we explore different themes every month in small groups, and the theme this month is grace. So when you told your farm story and used the phrase "some kind of grace," that really popped out at me. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on grace? How did that phrase come to you?
Wow, what a great question. There's a particular teaching that comes from yoga, you know, that says that grace is received in the chalice of gratitude. You know, grace is received in the cup of gratitude. And with all of these practices, there seem to be some real fundamentals. And one is sincerity. You know, with all the different techniques, when you come back to the real sincere sense inside, but more than that, of how gratitude completely inclines the mind toward grace. And there's a practice that's referred to in the Buddhist tradition where it's called gladdening the mind. And I have one friend in particular. It's a part of a ritual of his practice. Before he sits, he reflects on gratitude, on what he's grateful for. And when you can take that time to open to gratitude, there's such a profound shift. It becomes less about doing and more about receiving. So thank you for naming that, because that's such a sweet, ultimately that's where it all takes us. Yeah. Boy, speaking of gratitude, I'm grateful to be here, and I'm sorry we don't have more time, but I'd be happy to chat afterward. A few quick announcements. Colleen, are you here? Oh, good. So one thing that can be really, really helpful in your practice is to associate with like-minded people. And so IMCW has something called spiritual friends groups, where you get together on a somewhat regular basis, and you have some time to meditate together, and then in a structured way, time for sharing, just about how you're applying mindfulness in your life. So Colleen, you are in Falls Church, and your group is looking for a member or two? Looking for a group. Okay, great. But then you're in Falls Church. Wonderful. So what I'd like to suggest is, if you're interested in joining one of these groups, they can be really, really wonderful. I think we've formed a few here. Yes, you love your group. Testament over here. Yeah. How many people in your group?
There are 5 of us now, and we're looking for 2 or 3 more in the Alexandria, Arlington area.
Wonderful. Looking for a few more. So tell you what, Colleen, if you want to come up, and if you don't mind hanging out for a little bit, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about spiritual friends groups and how they work, we'll be here to chat about it, and we'll see what we can form up. I'll send an email out as well. So that is happening. If you want to be on the email list and you're not, you can sign up at the back. Thank you for your support for the church and myself. We've got cookies, fresh baked cookies. So if that doesn't pump up the gratitude, I don't know what will. Enjoy your holidays. You know, you probably know Ram Dass's statement where he said, "Whenever you think you're enlightened, go home for the holidays." You know. So may you find non-judging awareness your companion as you head into the holidays. I'll see you next week. Thank you so much.